Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have a very special guest with us, Minister of State for Commerce with independent charge, Nirmala Sitharaman, who is about to leave for Nairobi for the very crucial WTO ministerial talks, where India, along with other developing countries, will be defending its stance on a number of very critical issues which affect India's food security, which affect various other aspects of India's economic growth. And she did win half the battle earlier last year when this government insisted that food security and the right to hold right to have public stock holding of food stocks but could not be compromised, and it was India's right. Now that issue is again coming up at the WTO for a final perhaps agreement, and she'll be talking about that too. Welcome to our show, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman. So you fought valiantly last year and got India a reprieve on the food security front and on the public stockholding issue. Again, I see from news reports that the developed countries' economies are like the US and EU are making noises about putting some quantitative cap on India's procurement of food grains for food security, or some financial cap. Will that be a big issue when you go there?
Well, we certainly are looking for a permanent solution for this public stock holding of food grains. All right, last year, due to the support and leadership of the Prime Minister, we were able to obtain a peace clause, which gave us a kind of assurance that till a permanent solution is arrived at, we shall not be drawn to the courts, or there shall not be litigation if we support our farmers, the poor farmers, or if we give subsidized food grains for those poor consumers. So the peace clause is definitely something which gives you a breather. Eventually, there should be a permanent solution.
Okay. So eventually, when you say eventually, is there a time frame, or what do you make of some of the reports or hints coming from the WTO Secretariat that the EU, particularly the European countries, want to raise that issue? Now, where are we on that? I mean, of course, you won half the battle. So,
well, the process of talking out issues before we really go to Nairobi are ongoing. Our representative in Geneva participates in all the discussions. So, what is the time frame? We don't know. And in fact, that is one of the arguments last year when we insisted on having a peace clause. So, if the work plan doesn't have a timeline, we should not be left high and dry, was our concern. And that has been, I'm very grateful, that has been addressed by the WTO in giving us a peace clause. So, the permanent solution is something which has to happen just so that the matter comes to a technical closure.
Okay. Could you explain, ma'am, for our viewers in simple terms as to what this problem is about? Now, there is a lot of confusion about food procurement, our public stock holding. Now, there is a view that historically maybe some mistake was made by developing countries, because in the early 90s, when the price of procurement was what was determined, it was based on some rupee in rupee terms, and not adequate safeguards at that time was created, because nobody anticipated this kind of problem, that the price that India could offer its farmers, the government, should be inflation adjusted or raised in line with the inflation increase in prices of food grains. So is that part of the problem, that that today we are facing, because of those ambiguities, we are not able to sort of come up with a very firm agreement on this?
First thing, we are not the only countries who procure food grains.
There's Pakistan, Indonesia, everybody does.
China
does,
and many other countries. So holding of stocks, public holding of stocks, is not something which is peculiar to India. That's one thing. Second,
that's why developing countries are together on this.
Second,
you're saying it's not an Indian problem.
It's not an Indian problem. And the other issue which is also equally concerning is we procure not everything which is produced. We procure only that much which is required. For our PDS, you need grains to distribute for the poor, and to that extent you procure from, say, the poor farmers who don't benefit from a market mechanism. And therefore you ensure that they get a minimum support price, and the procurement goes towards distribution eventually for people who need the grains. That is why it is just not wheat and rice, it's also other grains.
Other grains, sure.
Now the whole issue is, when you obtain a certain portion of the large quantity which is produced in this country and do it strictly for the PDS, you don't release it in the market. It is not trade distorting. And therefore, from the point of view of a responsibility of a government to hold the stock, to distribute it to people who deserve it, and which is your public distribution program, which is a duty of this government, we do it, and we say you cannot question that under the garb of, is it trade distorting? That is one thing. Second is, the international market price, which eventually influences your market, because partly all of us are opened up now. So the price that at which you procure and the price between the international price or your market price and the price at which you're procuring, the difference is something which is treated as, we have to take that on board and we have to calculate what kind of support you're giving. Now, in that there are certain limitations. But on this, we want to have a formula to arrive at a solution. So what we ask for when we are looking for a permanent solution, these are the intricacies, these are the technicalities on which homework will have to be done, and all of us arrive at a solution saying, all right, which is your base year based on which you determine the price, average price? Is it got to be as it exists now, 86 and 88? Which is very, very far removed from today. These are the kind of issues. So a permanent solution is something where all countries will have to sit and work out what forms the contours of it.
Tell me, as I understand, the developed countries did not raise a big issue on this until we brought the National Food Security Law in Parliament. I somehow found that the National Food Security Act, which in some ways, which created a permanent legally mandated system of procurement and providing food security to the very poor, that's when they started sort of raising issues of protest. Is that right? Is that understanding right?
Well, I think we may quote that here, but many other countries, no such law exists. But the fact is, when you start procuring agricultural commodities, there is this perception you can't go on giving subsidy, you have to be subsidy free. Although, when you talk of subsidy, there is no level playing field. Even as far back as when you were talking about Uruguay round, the subsidy which the developed economies were giving for their farmers have all been taken on board, and they are not negotiable anymore. Whereas we are expected to cut down the subsidies that we give, which we find is unacceptable.
So in a sense, there are double standards, because I'm told recently the Americans passed a law in which they actually increased their subsidies further, export subsidies beyond the de minimis level.
That's right.
And they are not willing to discuss cutting down their subsidy levels, which everybody knows is data, which is very high. In fact, I'm told that they're just subsidizing 3,000 cotton farmers in the US, and they give some $2.5 billion to them every year.
Farmers in general are subsidized both in the US and in
Yeah, cotton is a big issue because
European
they have been sort of, they have been, it's been a particularly contentious issue. Now tell me, where do the developing countries stand? Now, before the talks, you must have spoken to many of the developing countries. Is there a joint strategy with which you are going? Because one is told that one or two developing countries which were earlier part of this bloc, like Brazil, they seem to be moving towards the US and maybe agreeing to some of the subsidies that the developed countries are at present giving, not really sort of opposing those subsidies. Is there some kind of a division that is happening among the
if there is one,
countries?
it is not apparent. We are certainly talking with a lot of countries and engaging with them to explain our position, making sure that these countries understand the importance of supporting India on these issues, because these are not issues which are peculiar to India, as I said, and therefore the engagement is an ongoing process. We certainly don't keep account of how many are with us now as different from how many were with us 10
because it's a dynamic process. When you get there, then you will
many more things will become obvious.
So, tell me, there is another issue which I want to discuss with you. I again read in the newspapers that the Americans and the Europeans, they are willing to carry forward the Doha development round, the development dimension of the Doha development round, but within that they are trying to now argue that they will do it provided developing countries like India and China, whom they now describe as advanced developing, they are trying to sort of recreate some nomenclatures about developing countries, provided they give up on the embedded equity principle of special and differential treatment for developing countries as opposed to the developed, as well as the special safeguard mechanism which exists again as part of the equity principle. Is that, I mean, do you fear that you will have to sort of negotiate hard to sort of retain that? I mean, you as in all developing countries together?
We very clearly reject this differentiated treatment. Within the emerging economies, just because India is growing at 7.57% kind of a rate, one cannot say that you are different from the other emerging countries because your GDP is growing at this rate. Because all of us know, and it is apparent, that the level of development in different parts of the country varies so much. Within a metropolitan city, you find that there are areas where you have people of some standard of living and some others, unfortunately, in a totally different level. So the 7.5 or 7% GDP growth rate has not evenly given its effects onto all the segments of our population. So as a result, to treat us differently from other developing countries is unfair, and it's too early for us to be categorized as advanced among the emerging.
But you consider there is always an attempt to do that.
Yes, and we have rejected it, and I strongly say a big no to it. That is my
because based on our per capita income, I don't think we are even we could be called a middle income or advanced middle income at this stage.
So that we are making it very clear. Then you also referred to this safeguard mechanism. That safeguard SSM, as it's called, the safeguard mechanism is absolutely critical, because if suddenly there is a surge in trade, import, what is it that I have to protect my industries or agriculture?
Especially vulnerable sections like farmers, etc.
That's right. And therefore we are saying, let the ministerial declaration mention that there shall be a special safeguard mechanism which shall be provided for us.
Is it being mentioned? I mean, the draft...
Well, we don't know. See, the draft declaration which has come out is written by 3 facilitators. And they've given a very big caveat saying they've just created a first version. The language or the agenda in it is not something which they were mandated to include, and therefore let this not be taken as something to start with. It is just a draft.
Okay, just a draft.
So what we are saying is, it's fine, we'll work on this draft, and we shall certainly express our ideal ministerial declaration, and in which the part 1 will be somewhat like the preamble, which will tell us all that which has been agreed upon, and part 2 will be the ones where everything which are being negotiated will find a place.
Okay.
So that which we are going to till in Nairobi, the negotiations, whatever they arrive at, will have to find a place in part 2.
So ma'am, you're saying that the special and differential treatment for the developing countries as a block, without trying to split them, is non-negotiable.
Yes, we cannot be differentiated.
And special safeguard mechanism is also non-negotiable.
Yes, it is required.
It's required.
While that is not required, this is required.
Okay, and of course, for special and differential treatment for the larger developing bloc is also part of the equity principle, right?
No, for the larger developing bloc, you are taking some out and saying
no. Without taking some out, as a special
obviously
treatment for them is part of the.
That's right.
The earlier equity principle was embedded
That's
even
right.
in the Uruguay round,
That's
right? Now, so agriculture will be a big issue, right?
Yes.
You expect that there will be a lot of contestation between
That's right.
between India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia on the one hand, and US and EU on the other hand.
Right.
Now, tell me why are the US and European representatives beginning on such a disagreeable note? Because I am told that the draft which the facilitators have made appears to be not so sensitive to the requirements of the developing world. That's what I read in the newspapers.
To be fair,
so is that a good note to start on? I mean,
well, they also have equally distanced it from the actual WTO negotiations. Okay. The covering letter which is issued along with this says these 3 people have been asked to do the first work. The language or the contents of the agenda are not were not mandated to them. So I think it will be unfair to even sit on judgment of it. So we should work towards.
And so therefore you're really hopeful that these 2 aspects which are critical to us and to other developing countries, that is special safeguard mechanism and special treatment for the developing world, will be there.
Special and differential treatment will not be acceptable, because we cannot be differentiated from other emerging economies just because we are growing at 7%. We are a developing country, we still will continue to be one. We cannot, just because our growth rate is 7.5, be treated differently from other developing countries. That is one aspect. The safeguard mechanism about which we are talking, we need it just to use it as an instrument to make sure that any import surge does not hurt us. We should have that mechanism in order to ward off that surge in import. So one is no, the other is yes.
And what are the other important issues that you think will come up at the talks, which you may have to really defend in terms
I look at
in terms of our interests?
There is a certain unease that the Doha development round, as it started in 2001, has not really delivered. That is one school of thought with which certain countries
multilateralism versus regionalism.
With which one section wants to recast the Doha development round and saying that it is not delivered, which disappoints me, because trade is not the only issue. Development is a larger, and that was recognized under Doha developmental agenda. My worry is, if 14 years we are blaming, saying it has not delivered, for a minute I want to agree with that, but to say, look at the Bali agreement, which we need to honor. It was the last ministerial, and countries agreed on a Bali agreement. My question is, 14 years is not delivered, All right, for a minute I agree with you. But has Bali been honored?
Okay, which is so recent. Yeah.
That's right. So let us,
2013, yeah.
that's right. So let us look at the elements which were agreed upon in Bali. Let's agree on that. Let us deliver and honor
Elements
Bali.
like, give me one or two.
Well, from Bali, only trade facilitation is moving forward.
Yeah, which they wanted and which we agreed to.
Agreed, we'll also ratify it once the cabinet clears it.
Yeah.
Now I think about 53 countries out of the 161 have ratified it. But you need to have 2/3 before it gets to the implementation stage. Food public stock holding was another element.
In fact, the two were supposed to go together.
That's right.
So we have agreed to trade facilitation, but they have not fully delivered.
That's right.
Although
So that is the second I can count. Third, there were quite a few issues related to LDCs, which have to be honored. Now, this ministerial, 10th ministerial, is happening in Kenya, in an African country. I wish the LDCs related issues are also going to find a respectable place, and they are honored too. So that is another.
tell me, there's one view that multilateralism hasn't delivered, and therefore there's been huge growth in regional trade arrangements, bilateral trade arrangements. There is a lot of research and data to show that under regional trade arrangements, trade has grown more than perhaps under multilateral arrangements, although the ideal situation is to have multilateral agreement, right? Now, the US signed the TPP agreement, which is being seen as the mother of all regional, trade arrangements, Trans-Pacific Partnership, 12 countries. Now, and that was tied up in October. Now, is the US using that as a kind of bargaining lever to push the developing countries in the WTO to agree to a lot of things?
Well, multilateralism is something which we in India respect. We want it to be honored, and we should all work to ensure that it remains a dynamic institution.
Yeah.
To hold it responsible for not delivering will be unfair, because it is, after all of us who are members of it, and we will have to work towards it. Regional agreements can happen. We are also engaging in RCEP negotiation with the ASEAN plus countries.
Yeah. Which includes China also. Yeah.
That's right. Now, TPP is something, yes, the Americans have concluded. It has countries with varying economies. Vietnam can coexist with the US. Peru can coexist with Canada. Brunei Darussalam can exist with the, Australia. So you have countries belonging and with economies which have different characteristics all under it. It's a large framework of an agreement, and also emphasizes on harmonization of standards. American standards are the ones which many of them will have to now comply. If I understand it right, they also have a dispute redressal mechanism of some sort.
Which is controversial actually, which allows global multinationals to have the same status as sovereign states when it comes to, in fact,
whereas what I would believe is many regional agreements were eventually going to get, in a way, subsumed under the WTO. And as and when any dispute arises in any one of these regional agreements too, it will be the WTO's redressal body, which actually has done a very decent job over the decades, which will be the dispute redressal mechanism. So, we in India strongly believe in multilateralism. We may be part of, let us say, RCEP and many others, SAFTA and so on, regional agreements, but we want the WTO to be an effective and dynamic organization.
And one final question, you won't allow new issues to be brought in? There are some reports that the West wants new issues, so-called Singapore issues, competition policies, labor standards, environment standards, etc., to be dovetailed into which are not there. So,
see, first of all,
is that fair?
Non-trade issues actually should not be part of these negotiations. If they have something to do with trade, and if they are trade-related issues, we don't mind discussing it, but we do not want it to be a binding agreement.
Get embedded as part of the...
That's right. We do not want to, under WTO, discuss non-trade issues, But if it is trade issue, trade related issues, we don't mind discussing them, but we don't want them to be binding on us.
And this is an understanding that China and other developing countries have along with India, that non-trade issues should not be brought
Well,
into
we
this?
are at least stating it very clearly.
Clearly, okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, for talking to us. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.